Okay, so I am doing my presentation over Emile Durkheim, and just for future reference, I'm going to be placing the little audio button in the bottom right corner, just in case it's kind of hard to see. So, we will continue on with the presentation. So, our first question is, who was Emile Durkheim? To start out, his first real name is David, so I found that really interesting. But Emile, essentially, he was a French social scientist. He was born in April of 1858 in France, and he later died in 1917. But he was born in a Jewish family, and something I found interesting was that his father, grandfather, and great-grandfather were all rabbis. Um, so, of course, he started his education in a rabbinical school, but he soon switched schools because he really wanted to study religion from an agnostic standpoint and not from a Jewish standpoint. Um, but essentially, as a student, he loved education so much he then became a teacher and really started teaching others about his scientific approach to society in general. And for the fun little side part, he did get married. He got married to Louise Dreyfus, but he got married in 1887 and did have two children, Marie and Andre. But Andre was sadly killed in World War I. But yeah, he was just a French social scientist who really sought out to educate others on what he had found. So, our second question that we're going to go over is, what was the path of Emile's education? So, we learned from the previous slide that as a young boy he started off in rabbinical school, but wanted to study religion from an agnostic standpoint, so he dropped out of that. And then he went on to various French schools. He went on to teach in rabbinical schools, high schools, for about 5 or so years, but then really started teaching at prestigious colleges. Something to note was around 1906 or something, he did become a professor of educational science at the Sorbonne. I'm going to say that wrong, but it was the Faculty of Letters, which was a big accomplishment for him. But something else that he did was he wrote many books, and so as you see, I've put some on the screen. Some of the noteworthy ones would be the division of labor in society, the rules of sociological method, suicide, the elementary forms of religious life, and the dualism of human nature and the social conditions. And so he really put his thoughts onto paper so others could kind of understand where he was coming from. So my third question is, in summary, what was Emile's focus? And I wanted to put this just to give a really short statement, just to kind of introduce what I'll be talking about. His focus was really clear. He focused on social change along with the industrial society. He wanted to know how social order was achieved. He also wanted to know how it was maintained whenever society continued to progress throughout the years. He also focused on social organizations and social relationships that adapted from that change in societies such as traditional and modern. But I think his main point would be that it all has to work together in order for society to function, which is functionalism. So I'm going to go into more detail on what exactly Emile studied and focused on later in this PowerPoint. So now we're getting into the good stuff. Um, so another question I have is, what are social facts? Um, so essentially, we know that from the book, social facts are the external social forces that regulates and constrains the way of acting, thinking, and feeling in a society. So some of those forces would be structures or norms, beliefs, practices, anything like that. So in short, social facts are how we study society today and how we indicate social patterns, which I think is cool. So some examples of social facts would be marriage, divorce, religion, crime, homelessness, education, or really anything that could be classified as a thing, or anything that we can't measure directly, if that makes sense. So another thing I kind of want to cover is the term sui generis. Sorry if I botched that, but it's a Latin word, and it means of the group in of itself. So Emile talks about how society has its own reality, which is what this term is. It's essentially a collective reality that exerts its own force, independent of individuals. So what I get is that society constrains how we think, feel, and act due to everyday custom and norms. So social facts are huge for us. It's something that I think is there and no one really kind of identifies what it is. We're just all experiencing it without even realizing it. But this was huge for Emile. So our next question is, what is functionalism? I chose this picture because I think it just really explains it perfectly. It's everything. Everything is together and squished, but it needs to work together in order for society to remain stable. So we're going to take a deeper look into what functionalism is and how it plays into the life work of what Emile did. So if we were to break down functionalism even more, I would say that it's how every part of society functions together. It has to work together. So functionalism emphasizes societal equilibrium. So if something happens that messes up the natural order, then society must adjust so that stability can be reached again. I actually talked about this in my analysis paper on the Davis and Moore theory. And I said, let's talk about a body. A body has so many different parts that are independent of its own, but they're all needed for the body to function. And so if something were to be removed from the body, like an arm, the body can still function, but it needs time to regulate again in order for it to work as one. So another example of what functionalism is, I think crime and delinquent behaviors was a good example, because these behaviors are normal, which is weird to say, but it's necessary for social systems. Another example would be the educational system, how we have taxes with school. It all works together in order for society to remain stable. And this was also a huge thing that Emile focused on, was that without functionalism, without society functioning together, we will never be stable. Okay, so this slide has a lot, so bear with me. But our first question is, what is the division of labor, or DOL? So the division of labor is the separation of occupational sectors, okay, and workers into specialized spheres of activity. So for Emile Durkheim, this really provided a social interdependence. And so now on to the traditional and modern societies and how solidarity comes into play. Our next question is, what are the differences between traditional and modern societies? And really, it's a very clear, and it's just by looking at the words. A traditional society is made up of homogeneous people that have the same beliefs and values, religion, backgrounds. And the difference is social norms are very strong, and social behavior was regulated. It was all the same, along with collective consciousness that ruled as well. Compared to a modern society, it holds a complete division of labor, like beliefs and backgrounds. Something I loved for quotes for traditional, it says that the society is in the individual. And in a modern society, the individual is the society. So I think that really clears it and sums it up perfectly. But I also want to talk about mechanical solidarity and organic solidarity. And so that's our next question. What is the difference between those? So the modern solidarity goes with traditional societies, and those are essentially the social bonds and the cohesion resulting from the overlapping social ties that characterizes the traditional societies, like those common beliefs, those shared values, and strong group identity. Now, when it comes to the modern society, that's where organic solidarity comes into play. And those are the social ties and cohesions produced by the functional and social interdependence of individuals and groups. So, very similar, but also very, very different. Okay, so if I'm being honest, this is the whole reason why I chose to do this project over Emile, was his focus on suicide. And my first question is, what does suicide have to do with Emile? And it's just so fascinating to me. So the main focus that Emile really focused in on were the social structures. So much like the division of labor and things that create social solidarity, and that integrates people in society. So when it comes to the topic of suicide, Emile wanted to prove just how important social integration is for people. It is vital for people to feel like they belong somewhere. He also wanted to prove that different social conditions can produce different social consequences, which I think is a huge statement. So the next question is suicide a social fact? Yes, I think that is very clear, but something that you need to understand on a deeper level, I think. And so I think it's important to point out really that even though suicide is an individual choice and action, it is still considered a social phenomenon. Another key thing to point out is that suicide is not a social problem, technically. It is a problem, but it's essentially normal due to the fact that like every society has a level of suicide. So if we're being technical, it's not a social problem, it's a phenomenon. But it is considered a social fact because it draws a picture on the social relationships that constrain people, and that in return it regulates social cohesion that's needed to keep a society running. I think this is a much higher and more intense example than, let's say, crime. It's needed to keep society going in a circle. It's a harsh truth, but it is truth. So, with all that being said, different types of society context does produce different conditions that do lead to suicide, which we're going to dig in more on the next slide of the different levels of suicide that Emile defined. Okay, a little more on suicide. So I have as my first question, what are the different types of suicide in traditional and modern societies? But before I do that, I do want to clarify what anami is, because I had never heard of anami until this class and until reading the book. But essentially, it's defined as feeling disconnected from moral norms and rules of society. It's a society that celebrates individualism, but that society runs a risk of forgetting to tell others what they can and cannot do, which is huge. And so going back to the different types of suicide, in a traditional society, Emile classified the altruistic suicide to go along with the characteristics of a traditional society. And the altruistic suicide essentially is condoned by the group, by a group of people. So people feel like they must meet these expectations of their community or group, and if they don't, they commit suicide. And it almost becomes an honorable thing to do. So, which I have also never heard of until this class, doing more research. But one culture in Japan, they call it honor suicide. So if a man cannot honor his family, or if they cannot take care of his family, he commits suicide, and that man is looked at as honorable, which I just blows my mind. But that is, I think, a very traditional view, I guess, of suicide. But when it comes to the modern society, he viewed the egotistic and anomic suicide as kind of going along with the characteristics of modern society. And so the first one, the egotistic, this is suicide under social conditions. So they essentially like loosely bound themselves to others or social groups. Something else was that single people feel more likely to kill themselves because they don't have a husband, they don't have a wife, they don't have children, they don't really have anything keeping them there, which I think is a kind of a perfect example of the NAMI, of feeling disconnected from norms, the norm of getting married, the norm of having kids, the norm of being, in a community group. They don't feel those, and so why be here if they don't have it? And that's the view of that. So for the anomic suicide, this really happens when society experiences a major disruption that disturbs the established norms, as one would say. So examples of this would be war, natural disasters, something like 9/11, something that people are not prepared for and have not, prepared their hearts for it, and it comes as a surprise, and they don't know how to handle it, and so they commit suicide and all of the disruption around them, which is absolutely sad. Suicide is something that I don't know how to process or handle. Growing up, it was something I never heard of or learned about, and then in high school, I had friends who committed suicide, and I have friends who dealt with it, and that's something I never dealt with, and so I find it really interesting isn't the word. I find it intriguing, I don't know the right word, to understand why they feel that way. My closest friend back home has always dealt with being depressed and being suicidal, and she really opened up and explained why, and she definitely feels more of the egotistic style. She doesn't feel connected, even though she knows she is, she doesn't feel it. And it breaks my heart to think people don't feel like they belong or that they're not special. Suicide absolutely breaks my heart, and I want to learn more about it so I can help connect with people because I don't have a personal experience with it. So I absolutely loved learning more about these styles and understanding why people feel these. Because in the end, like learning from the book, suicide is caused by social factors of these worlds, something that they're not prepared for. They can't handle it. So yeah, these are the different types of suicide that Emile identified in the traditional and modern society. Okay, so my next question, I have three on this slide. The first one is religion a social force? So I enjoy learning about this as well because this is coming from someone who grew up in a Jewish background but then chose to be agnostic, so he could study it objectively, but which can't happen. But yeah, so he wanted to learn religion from an agnostic standpoint, and so he mentions in the book and in these notes that I've been reading about how religion acts as an integrating social force. And he actually wrote heavily about the social nature and functions of religion. So religion is also, it's a social fact as well. It's a social force and social fact. And unlike any other social facts, it can't be studied objectively. And that's something he ended up recognizing later on. So the next question, they kind of go hand in hand, but what is considered sacred and what is considered profane? So in the title of the book, or one of the sections, it says religion and the sacred. And I was like, what does it mean, the sacred? But sacred are essentially all things society sets as part of special or that requires relevance, quote unquote. And profane are like ordinary, mundane, non-sacred things in a society. But the thing is, who is able to be the one who decides what is sacred and what is profane? I mean, what is sacred to me might be mundane to someone else, and vice versa. And so religion is just nothing that can be studied objectively. Everyone is going to feel differently about it and have different biases. And so that's something that I think Emile really realized, that you can't study it objectively, and what's special to one won't be special to someone else. Okay, so after the topic of suicide, this is also something that I find very interesting. And so this question I have is, what does religion and science have in common? I just think it's funny because, like, God created science. I mean, He created the world. He created the science. So, like, they have everything in common. Like, they are one. But to many people, science is denouncing religion, but in fact, it is proclaiming it and lifting it up, which I think is just kind of funny. But I think something important to note is that although Emile was agnostic, he did recognize that scientific knowledge alone is not enough to tie people together, which is huge. But Emile believed that religion and science, they have interdependent functions, and are not in conflict with each other. But I think one of the most interesting things I got out of the book was when it says science provides knowledge while religion provides actions. So I want to say that again because I think it's cool. Science provides knowledge while religion provides action. So I think science is a really amazing and cool thing. It helps us understand on a deeper level why things are the way they are. I think people in today's world want to have all of the answers to everything, and we're not God. And I think science is the closest thing that allows people to feel like they know more about the fundamentals of the earth. Does that make sense? Like, I think people cling to science because they're like, well, this can give me all of my answers because I want all of the answers, when in fact, we're not supposed to know all the answers. God is the only one who knows everything. Because if we knew everything, why would we need God? You know, why would we need to have faith in something that is bigger than us? Because God's bigger than us. Science is not bigger than us. And so the question, I think, is silly. Like, what does religion and science have in common? God created both. He created all of it. Now, I am aware that religion does not just classify Christianity. Religion is also every other religion. But I think, going back to what I said earlier, people cling to science because they think that can give them all their answers, when religion doesn't give them all the answers that they want. And so that's just something I found really amazing, reading more about what Emile had to say about religion and science. So, wrapping everything up, I think Emile Durkheim is a man who desired to have a deeper understanding of how society works and functions. And he felt like he needed to be so unbiased to everything, that he removed religion from him, to see everything, I think, from a bird's eye view. And while he gave us legitimate facts that we now, are living out today when it comes to division of labor, social facts, social forces, modern and traditional society, like all of these things he made known. But in the end, it just shows that there is an emptiness and a hole he's trying to fill in his heart of needing to know all of the answers and needing to know the difference of religion and science and all of these things. And he was a great man who really, he's known as the father of sociology. I think that's huge. But he's just missing the main key. Because while it's nice to know the answers, we're not supposed to, because we're supposed to put our faith in someone that's bigger than us. But I do have a great appreciation for him in his view of suicide and trying to understand why, because I think that's something that people aren't really focusing on. They want to focus on ending suicide, but you got to start at the root of it. Why do they feel that way? And he really explained that in the altruistic, the anomic, and the egotistic styles of suicide. And so I loved this. I really did. I love understanding why people believe what they believe and what made them who they are today. He died a man who people are still talking about, I mean, years later, which I find just remarkable. So in the next couple slides, I'm just going to put my sources. But I do hope you enjoyed this. I do hope I didn't botch his name too much or any Latin words. But yeah, I did enjoy this and I appreciate this. Thank you.